good evening. On behalf of the head of the department, Professor Ochieng Odiambo, who is unfortunately absent, but who sends his very best wishes for this evening's proceedings. And on behalf of the Department of History and Philosophy, and the Nation Publishing, I welcome you to the 30th Elsa Goveia Memorial Lecture. Now, 30 years is, of course, an important milestone for us. We do not intend to stop at 30, however, but this is a special evening, and we decided that what we would do is 2014, we would commemorate one of the centenary anniversaries. Initially, there was some discussion about whether it would be World War I or whether it would be the Garvey movement, because this is the 100th anniversary of both. And as you can see, we opted for the Garvey movement. So that is a brief, info on why, in a way, the topic was chosen. But 2014 is an important year for us in the department. So, colleagues, PVC Cobley, Professor Emeritus Marshall, distinguished visitor Dr. Lamming, Ms. Hope from the Nation, Dr. Brown, who will introduce the guest speaker, and our guest speaker, Mr. Hill. Warm welcome to all of you, and particularly a warm welcome to the members of the Rastafari community. What I will do at this point is I will ask Ms. Hope to bring you a message of greetings from the Nation Publishing, who have once again kindly consented to sponsoring this year's event. So, Ms. Hope.
With protocol already established, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It gives me great pleasure to address you this evening on behalf of the Nation Publishing Company Limited, especially as we mark 30 years of the Elsa Goveia Lecture. For the Nation, this would be our 18th year of collaborating with the University of the West Indies to host this important event. To quote from Marcus Garvey, the focus of our lecture this evening, "A people without the knowledge of their past history, origin, and culture is like a tree without roots." As publishers of the Nation newspaper, we remain committed to supporting this event, not just because we appreciate the contributions of icons such as Elsa Goveia and their influence in shaping the modern Caribbean, but also because we understand the importance of reviewing historical themes in critical and stimulating forums. This helps us to widen our perspective of who we are, where we have come from, and has a significant impact on how we chart the course forward. With the Elsa Goveia Lecture being in its 30th year, I felt it important to remind ourselves of the legacy of the late Elsa Goveia, a dedicated Caribbean academic and the first female professor of West Indian history at the University of the West Indies. Renowned Guyanese novelist Wilson Harris, in the third of his Edgar Mittelholzer, pardon my pronunciation, lectures, delivered in Guyana in 1970, stated, "In a society which has been shot through by diverse interracial features and intercontinental thresholds, we need a philosophy of history which is original to us and yet capable of universal applications." At that time, he indicated that Elsa Goveia was one of two Caribbean historians who ably reflected that philosophy. Her groundbreaking and inspiring efforts in historical research and analysis would have made a significant impact on nation building and independence around the Caribbean region. It is simply a privilege to recognize this remarkable woman that was Elsa Goveia and applaud her work, which, as stated on the website of McMaster University, remains a cornerstone and pioneering study in the West Indies. I eagerly look forward to what I'm sure will be another thought-provoking lecture in the Elsa Goveia Lecture Series by tonight's guest speaker, Professor Richard Goodridge, on another iconic Caribbean personality, the late Marcus Garvey. On behalf of the Nation Publishing Company Limited, thank you.
I guess all I can say is that I think Ms. Hope knows something that I don't know. Okay, to introduce this year's speaker, we have asked Dr. David Brown, who is, I suppose, known as principal of Queen's College, but we prefer to know him better, to say he's better known as a historian. And so, David, please come and introduce the speaker.
Thank you very much, Dr. Goodrich. I'm sure that tonight you will join me in welcoming Professor Hill to Barbados, to the campus of the University of the West Indies, and more so to the History Department. I must say that I've done some work on the Garvey movement, and I knew of Professor Hill from the 1980s, but it's the first time I've ever seen him. Tonight's 30th annual Elsa Goveia Memorial Lecture is entitled Marcus Garvey and the Cosmovision of Jamaican Revivalism. Very interesting topic. Professor Hill is a Jamaican and research professor at the University of California at Los Angeles and a visiting fellow at Sir Arthur Lewis Institute of Social and Economic Studies here at the University of the West Indies. He was educated at the London School of Economics, the University of Toronto, and the University of the West Indies. Professor Hill has published quite a number of books, including the famous multi-volume Marcus Garvey and the Universal Negro Association papers. He's also the literary executor of the CLR James works, and he's the editor of numerous editions of such works, and there are more to come in that CLR James series. He's preparing the Rastafari Bible, the Job version of Rasta, a combined biography of the Reverend Claudius V. Henry. Professor Hill is the recipient of the Gold Musgrave Medal for Distinguished Contribution to History, and he has delivered the 5th annual Distinguished Marcus Garvey Lecture at Liberty Hall, Jamaica. So, ladies and gentlemen, put your hand together and welcome Professor Hill to the podium.
Okay. Thank you very, very much, everyone, for taking time to come out this evening, and welcome. Thank you, Dr. Goodrich, and thank you for that warm introduction, David Brown. This is the first time that I've ever lectured at the Cave Hill campus of the University of the West Indies, so it's a very important moment in my life to be invited, and also to be invited for such a distinguished occasion to deliver the 30th lecture, Elsa Goveia Memorial Lecture. We may need to turn the lights down. Can we adjust the lights so that it's not washed out? Can you see the screen now? Okay, all right. In 1968, myself and a group of young, I emphasize young, Jamaican radicals decided to organize a series of lectures for the community. And the series was given at the Holy Cross Church Hall in Halfway Tree. That's the church hall there. I was appointed to deliver the first lecture in the series, and it was the very first public lecture I had ever given. And when I looked up, seated in the front row to the right, in the front, sat Professor Elsa Goveia. The lecture began at 2 o'clock, and it was like a Wednesday. And I couldn't believe what I saw, that Professor Goveia should take time from her busy schedule at the university to come out to hear a group of rank amateur youth presume to lecture on a historical subject. I found stunning, and I still do. I've never shared this story with anyone before because I'm so embarrassed when I reflect back on how it must have seemed. All I can say is that I hope tonight I can do a slightly better job than I did then. I would like to dedicate this lecture to our esteemed colleague, a great Barbadian, Professor Kamau Brathwaite, who, thank you. I had hoped that he would be able to be here tonight, but I understand he is not well enough to come out. But as the lecture proceeds, you will understand why he has been such an inspiration to so many of us. So let us begin. Carlo Ginzburg, my colleague at UCLA, and the great Italian historian who pioneered the field of what has come to be known as microhistory, with his two unbelievably thought-provoking books, The Night Battles, the story of the Benandanti, and The Cheese and the Worms, the 14th century Miller in Italy. He said in an interview with a Norwegian journal in July 2003, quote, "I believe that at decisive junctures in the research process, one must allow oneself to be stupid, simply to dwell in the state of not understanding. That leaves open to those chance occurrences from which unexpected discoveries spring." Tonight, I'm going to share the story of what it felt like to dwell in the state of not understanding. I know that we historians don't like to admit to something called not understanding. And I know that I've made discoveries along the way, and there was a time when I made a very important archival discovery, and I went to the nearest bar and I drank myself into a stupor. I felt like I had conquered the world, and I just decided to let it enjoy that moment. But there are moments when you are plain dumbfounded by what you discover, and that's what I want to talk about tonight. What happens when we run into something that we simply have no way of understanding? Tonight's lecture is a report on the way back from that state of non-understanding. In 1921, in April, Marcus Garvey visited Costa Rica. He visited Limon on the Caribbean side of Costa Rica, and that's him standing on the railway that's going to take him from Port Limon to the capital of San Jose. The Garvey movement in Costa Rica was one of the largest anywhere in the world, because there were thousands of West Indians who had gone to Costa Rica from the late 19th century to work on the banana plantations and also the railroad of United Fruit Company. That's a picture on the left of the Liberty Hall that they built in Limon. It's a massive building. It takes up an entire square block. It was built in 1922. It's still standing. And those are the stairs going up to the Assembly Hall on the second floor. When I visited in 1977, they organized a public meeting for me. And after the meeting, this elderly Jamaican man approached me and he asked me, did I know what happened to Marcus Garvey in England? And I said, yes, he died on June the 10th, 1940. And this man scoffed and he said, no. He said, they murdered him. I said, really? They murdered him? And he looked at me straight in the eye and he said, yes, they murdered him in an acid bath. And I was completely floored. I'd never heard this. I said, what do you mean? He said, yes, they put him in an acid bath. That's how he was killed. Now, I was so intrigued by this story that the next day I asked if, I could come out and visit him. He lived quite a way out in the bush outside of Limon. And a taxi took me there and I trekked through the bush to his house. And he never showed up and I kept calling. Now, when I look back and think about it, I'm a little amazed at how intrepid I was, because after the taxi left me, I was alone in the bush, and I wondered, well, maybe that wasn't so wise. I found my way back to Limon, and I was pretty annoyed with him. I felt he had stood me up. It's in preparing for this lecture and thinking about what Carlo Ginzburg had to say about dwelling in the state of not understanding, that I began to think about this. You see, these are photographs of Marcus Garvey in England, the first in 1928, and the second one in 1931. I discovered that there was a famous murder in 1949, committed in England by this man known as the acid bath murderer, John George Haig. In fact, it was the murder trial of the century up to that point in England, and it is the trial for murder that set the template for the celebrity, what we have come to know as the celebrity murder trial. And together with Heath and Christie, those are the three famous murder trials in England after 1945. Haig, in March of 1949, between March and July, killed 6 people, all of them using the acid bath technique. And it was the story of the day. Haig claimed to have killed more than 6 people. But the thing that gave his trial such a notoriety is that he claimed that he started to drink the blood of the first victim and he found that he had a taste for it. And so he became known as the acid bath vampire murderer. But women were also eagerly attracted. He was a very handsome-looking man, and he had very suave ways. And that's an image of the front page of the Daily Mirror from the 4th of March, when Haig is first arrested. That's him there being led to the Old Bailey, the trial at the Old Bailey. Haig murdered his victims believing that the principle of corpus delicti, meaning no body, therefore no proof of murder, would hold, except that the circumstantial evidence was so overwhelming that even though there were no bodies that the police could produce, because he had dissolved all of them in a mixture of sulfuric acid and other chemicals, he was still convicted. A search of Haig's workshop turned up papers tying him to 3 sets of murders, as well as a nearby dump whose yellowish, white-grayish matter yielded 28 pounds of melted body fat, part of the left foot eroded by acid, 3 gallstones, and 18 fragments of human bone eroded by acid. That's a picture of the workshop in Crawley in Surrey. That's the inside of the workshop. Those are the drums of sulfuric acid that he stored. That's a kind of garbage heap where he poured out the remains of the 6 individuals. He was executed on the 10th of August, 1940. This comes 9 years after the death of Garvey. And what I do believe is that this gentleman in Costa Rica read back to Garvey's dying in 1940 the idea of an acid bath murder. The thing, though, that puzzles me is that Haig killed his 6 victims through various methods, including gunshots. Haig used the acid to dissolve the bodies so that the bodies could never be found. My informant in Costa Rica was implying that no, they actually lowered Garvey into the sulfuric acid, and that's how he was killed. Well, I spoke about this in Jamaica fairly recently, and people said, yes, 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 we believe that's how they killed Garvey. I had to say, no, wait a minute, I'm trying to explain to you. Garvey wasn't killed that way, but my informant believed that. But people in Jamaica still clung to the idea that that was a very convincing narrative. And though I tried to persuade them, they still, at the end of my talk there, said, oh, yes, so that's how they killed Mr. Garvey. See, the mindset that Garvey could have died in this gruesome manner still has appeal. Now, I'm going to call Barry Chavans, of blessed memory, to our aid here tonight, because in 1987, Barry produced an essay called Garvey Myths Among the Jamaican People. And this is what one of Barry Chavans's informants told him. Quote, I was told that Marcus Garvey this is a Jamaican informant, was a kind of mysterious man. You couldn't do him anything. He was a mysterious man like a Superman. They set up all kind of various different traps to destroy him, because them didn't want him to preach and turn the people's heart back to Africa. But them couldn't catch him. One time they sent him to Spanish Town prison. So I learned. And they set him a bath, but they poisoned the bath to let him go in there and bathe and to kill him. And when him go to Spanish Town, him say, "No, not this one." See, the story of the bath as the technique of murdering Garvey still had some valence. And my informant in Costa Rica, I believe, recycled the story of the acid bath murderer, the vampire murderer, and simply applied it to Garvey. The point I want to make is that in the cosmovision of Jamaican revivalism, Garvey's death in England in June of 1940 was not simply a case of death or dying, but a case of destruction, i.e., the working of obeah, white obeah. This is what I'm trying to analyze, the way in which large numbers of Jamaicans, conditioned through this understanding or this cosmology of the world, see death not as innocent, but usually the result of destruction. So that in Jamaican revivalism, there is the tradition of what are known as destruction tables. When you really want to destroy someone, you organize a destruction table. The third edition of the OED defines cosmovision as a noun used in literary criticism or with reference to Mesoamerican peoples as a particular way of viewing the world or of understanding the universe. I think it's particularly relevant to a department of history and philosophy to be sensitive to investigating history not only as it happened, but as the way people imagined history happened and what it means. Now, the second instance of my state of not understanding occurred in Los Angeles in May of 2003. I had a Jamaican graduate student, and she told me that her father knew Marcus Garvey. And I said, "Well, I would love to meet your father." And she said, "Well, he's coming out to visit me. I would be happy to introduce you." So we arranged that when he came, I would take them to dinner at a lovely Jamaican restaurant. Any excuse to go to the Jamaican restaurant was welcome. And the Jamaican restaurant was in the black community on Crenshaw Boulevard. And that's a picture of the restaurant, Coley's Jamaican Restaurant. That's a picture of the kind of cooking they do. And this man said to me, "When Marcus Garvey spoke, you never saw him with no paper in him hand, no notes, nothing at all. Never had no paper, never need any, but him talk same way." Interesting, eh? Well, here is a picture of Garvey in 1920, speaking at the first International Convention of the Negro Peoples of the World. And he has plenty of paper that he's reading from. But in Jamaica, they said he never used any paper. People used to say, fallen angel. It was fallen angel. People said the angel used to whisper in him ear. That is how him got the words. So him never need no paper. Him get it through the angel, the fallen angel. I almost fell off the seat. I said, what are you talking about? He said, yes, the people says fallen angel. Angel sitting up on his shoulder, whispering into his ear. So that Garvey was speaking in a state of trance. Garvey was just channeling the words that were given, passed to him by the fallen angel. Now, as a schoolboy, you know, I was raised Catholic, so the Jesuits made sure to indoctrinate us with the doctrine of the fallen angel. So I heard that. I knew that. I didn't pay it any great attention. But I realized that, is there a popular notion of a fallen angel that I had missed? Yes, I had totally not known about the fallen angel that Jamaicans believe in and talk about. So I said to the man, help me, because, you know, I kept saying to him, how you spell it? How you spell falling? He said, no, it's not falling, it's fallen angel. Wow. I said, give me another example of how people might use it. And he said to me, is some people talk about my grandfather, all when him was over 80, him one could do the work of 4 men. You would never believe the work him one do. He was a farmer, used to plant land. People walk by and see him working. In the morning, you pass him again next day, you see the whole of the land plow up. No one man could do that amount of heavy work in one day, much less a man who was his age. People used to stop and look and say, fallen angel. My grandfather is him one do all that work. It could only be fallen angel to do all that work in one day, and his him one working. It's hard to believe, me know. Wow. So his grandfather has over 80 years, and he is a man of superhuman strength. Do you know that if you look in Genesis 6, the first time the Bible speaks of a fallen angel, they say that the fallen angel came about because the angels copulated with women. And the offspring of the woman turned into giants. They're called the sons of God. This past year, when I went back to Jamaica, I said to the lady who is our housekeeper, I said, tell me about the fallen angel. She said, me don't know, but them talk about them as giants that have tremendous strength. I didn't preface it with anything. In Jamaica, the idea of the fallen angel is that of a giant, and they're getting it from Genesis. Okay? So now, Mr. Berger is continuing. He not finished with me. He said, did you know that whenever Marcus Garvey left Jamaica, you never saw his wife? You'd always see her with him before he left, but then you never saw her again until after he returned to Jamaica. I found that very striking because I knew Mrs. Garvey, and she was a very, very feisty, dynamic woman. The idea that she would somehow shut herself away didn't didn't chime with the person that I knew. So I said to Mr. Berger, "What happened?" And this is what he said. "People said that Mr. Garvey put her to sleep." I would like to advise you gentlemen, don't try it at home. He put her to sleep. Well, quite apart from why he would want to do that, how could he just put her to sleep? And what does that mean? That is the mild trance idea. Garvey, in fact, is being thought of in mialistic terms. And one of the trances that come with mile is that people go to sleep for weeks on end. That's the power. After they give you the potion and you drink the potion, you become zombified. The point that I'm leading to is the recognition that Jamaica is a space that is highly charged ritualistically. It is a highly, highly charged ritual space. Starting with the maroon chromanti dance of the 18th century, right up to the 20th and 21st century, Rastafari Nyabingi. It is within the parentheses formed at one end by the maroon chromanti and the Nyabingi that Jamaican history is one of the most fiercely contested ritual spaces, not only of the Caribbean, but of anywhere in the world. Now, one visitor, famous English writer, Patrick Lee Fermor, famous travel writer, came to the Caribbean in the 1940s, and he wrote this book, published, I think, in 1950, The Traveler's Tree, A Journey Through the Caribbean Islands. Here is what Fermor said, quote, "Jamaica is bewilderingly prolific in unusual groups of human beings. Amalgamated Jews, Pocomania, Garveyism, the extinct Bedouinites, he means Bedouinites, Barmis, Obia men, the Maroons, the Rastafari. The list could still be further extended. Some of them, to be sure, possess exact equivalents elsewhere, but nowhere do they exist in such profusion." In 1919, the famous American folklorist Martha Beckwith arrived in Jamaica. She went on to produce this landmark study called Black Roadways, a study of Jamaican folklife, published in 1923. The first thing she published, however, was an article in January 1923 in the American Journal of Psychology entitled "Some Religious Cults in Jamaica." Oops. And this is the opening paragraph called "The Revivalists." Quote, "In the year 1860, a great wave of spiritual excitement swept the island of Jamaica and resulted in a religious revival among the Negroes. Its cause no one seems able to explain. Perhaps the impulse came from the United States in response to the high tension of the South on the eve of rebellion. Perhaps the antagonism of the more stable English and Creole population against the methods of the evangelistic orders had at that period reached the fighting point. Its result was the formation of religious groups who gathered about prophetic leaders and organized themselves into bodies of worshipers independent of the established churches on the island. the Revivalists, the Isaiahs, and the Bedouinites are examples of such organizations. That is where the use of the term revivalism in the Jamaican context comes from. The great 1860 to 1861 revival. So that when Jamaicans speak about prophetic religion, mass upsurges of religious excitement, they all refer to it as revivalism. It is that great revival of 1860 to 61 they're talking about. Now, in 1958, a famous German photographer, Herbert List, came to the Caribbean and produced a wonderful photojournal of his Caribbean travel. And in there are some stunningly beautiful photographs of revival events, just powerful. He captured the presence of revival just at the time of its peak, really. Here are a couple, another picture. Now, in 1952 to 53, an American professor also arrived in Jamaica by the name of Professor George Eaton Simpson from Oberlin College in Oberlin, Ohio. And he produced another landmark study published in the journal Social and Economic Studies of the Institute of Social and Economic Studies at Mona. It's entitled Jamaican Revivalist Cults. This really is the thing that forms the benchmark for all subsequent studies of revival religion. He took some magnificent pictures. That's one of a moonlight night baptism ceremony in the river. And in this study, Professor Simpson says, the revivalists of West Kingston, both Pocomanians and revival Zionists, by the way, the 1860 revival is known as Revival Zion. The revival of 1861 became very extreme. Those are the people who became known as Pocomania. So Pocomania and Revival Zion are rivals, okay? He says the revivalists of West Kingston, both Pocomanians and Revival Zionists, believe strongly in a world peopled by many spirits. Among my informants, the most popular spirits, quote, angels, protectors, messengers, are Michael and Gabriel. Following them in approximately this order are Samuel, Raphael, Jeremiah, Jesus Christ, God, Jehovah, omnipotence, Miriam, Mary, Satan, Holy Ghost, Moses. They don't exclude Satan. Satan is simply another powerful figure in this spiritual hierarchy and pantheon. That is unlike the Christian doctrine of Satan and the fallen angel. That's what I'm trying to get at. Jamaicans have completely transformed the Christian Satan into another kind of demon, one that they work with. You get the point? What I have to establish for you here at this point is that the concept of the fallen angel that Mr. Berger told me about in California has deep roots in the pantheon of revival spirits in Jamaica. What I have to do is to trace at least enough occasions where the fallen angel emerges that we can say, yes, it's not unknown in Jamaican thinking to have people believe in the fallen angel. Now, this is a sketch from Professor Simpson's research illustrating the elaborate arrangement for conjuring with the bones of a dead person. And this is a diagram. And this is what is known as a destruction table. He tells us, quote, "The operator," meaning a revival leader, "at a destruction table calls the air spirits and the earth spirits and invites them to come to the ceremony. Among the air spirits are Ariel, Lucifer, Tantir, and Vapor, god of the streams and ruler of the sea. All of these spirits work mischief. They are princes of evil, fallen angels. Raphael, Gabriel, Caswell, and other spirits are used only for religious ceremonies. The operator must reason with the spirits and control them. He tells them what he needs to have done. The other people hear what the operator says, but they can't hear what the spirits reply. Every operator has his own way of giving commands to such spirits. Some of the people who get, quote, in the spirit, act much like those who are, quote, in the spirit at a religious meeting. A person not in the movement could not tell the differences between the two types of possession. In the fallen angel's possession, right, there is more singing and less praying. Also, there is a beating of the feet on the ground all the while. In other words, depending on the context of what the revival table is hoping to achieve, the fallen angel can come in and possess people. And it's different from another kind of revival possession. In other words, it's not excluded. It's not morally repugnant. It is not doctrinally alien to the practice of revival. And we're going to see why. He goes on to talk about the kind of possession that occurs when the fallen angel takes possession. Prayers are addressed to the fallen angels by the operator and the participants. The prayers are in accord with evil influences, that is, with avenging enemies. Now, one of the great things that Professor Simpson did, he recorded the first recording of actual revival music. And that is Professor Simpson with his antique tape recorder. And that's the booklet that the Smithsonian Institution produced based on his recordings. That's a cover of the actual recording. If we had been able to set up the technology, but we were challenged and we couldn't, I would have been able to use this address, put it into a web browser, and you would and to stream the music so that you would hear it. Unfortunately, we can't do that. Now, in 1992, a few months before he died, this is a facsimile from his manuscript collection at Oberlin College. He was putting together an article summarizing his research on revival, and it's called Two Religious Cults in Jamaica, Revivalists and Kumina. Many of you will have heard of Kumina from St. Thomas in eastern Jamaica. It's a synthesis of his work and the work of Joseph Moore from Northwestern University, who started working in Morant Bay in 1949. And this is a listing of all of the, as it were, headings of this article that he projected. He never lived to complete it. We're going to look at number 10, Pocomania rituals in Morant Bay. And this is what he has to say. Pocomania rituals in Morant Bay. The Pocomania service centers around an altar which is set on a table or laid upon the ground. Then he says, another significant difference appeared in that part of revival and Pocomania ceremonies which marked the close of the first half of the service. In revival, at this point, food and drink from the altar are offered to all those in attendance. However, in Pocomania services, as well as in revival, this part of a ceremony is called, quote, the smashing of the first order. But in Pocomania, the careful arrangement of fruits and candles were disarranged and kicked out of place, and some fruits were hurled into the crowd in a spirit of hostility and unrest. At this point in Pocomania, after the smashing of the altar, the fallen angels are invoked and the devil is called upon. The four evangelists of the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the disciples, and many of the major and minor prophets came to the second half of the ceremony as fallen angels. However, the two strongest forces in revival, the Holy Ghost and Michael the Archangel, did not come, but were replaced by Lucifer. For crying out loud, what kind of theology is this? You see, I have to tell you, I went to 3 universities. Nothing prepared me to even begin to think that Lucifer could work interchangeably with the 4 major prophets of the New Testament. We have no conception of the power and the dynamism of Jamaican revivalism. Now, this is a young woman, brilliant young scholar, who just finished a PhD at Emory University in Atlanta. And she gave it a dread title, Gnostic Obia from Chukwu Abiyama to Jah Rastafari, a theology of the Jam African Obia Catholic Church. This is a well-known, very accomplished researcher on Jamaican folklore. As many of you here will know Maureen Warner Lewis. She was Maureen's chief research assistant. Now, I'm just saying, let us look at what her field data provides. She says, spirit stories, stories of spiritual affliction, spirit encounters, and spiritual victory abound as testament to the vitality of spirits. In a lively discussion before a healing service one Wednesday evening, a young female recited the story of how her sister, who, quote, have belly, was being cured by a famous revival pastor. Another woman spoke of seeing a group of animals, including rats, marching toward her bedroom. She had to rush to the door to stand guard and plead the blood of Jesus to rebuke them. An elderly woman, complimented this story by offering that she had to run out of her house one evening as a mongoose walked straight into her living room as she was watching TV. She states that the mongoose looked her straight in the eye, standing upright, and when she reached for the cutlass, it attacked her. She had to rush from the house in fear and trembling. But she was not surprised by these events, as the night before, quote, fallen angels had appeared outside the house. Such events were only two in a series of episodes later confirmed to be her neighbor, working Obia against her. This is in 2010. Belief in the fallen angel is still alive. Here is another piece of her data. To the question, what is a spirit? Answers were readily available. You don't know, Doppy, is the general reply, followed by a list of other spiritual entities, including demons, rolling calf, fallen angels, and spirit beings, such as messengers and journeymen, which include Jesus and Miriam. Jesus and Miriam is mixed in with all of these spirits. What you have really going on is a Jamaican system of demonology, which is not at all the Christian system of demonology. This Jamaican system of demonology has taken personalities and figures from the Christian pantheon of spirits and syncretized them into an Afro-Jamaican or Afrocentric cosmovision of the spiritual world. In other words, this is a piece of the iconography of the Christian theology of the fallen angel. Okay? You see the archangel there with his wings, that's Archangel Michael, and that's the fallen angel. He's about to be consumed by the lava. That is a totally different world to the Jamaican system of demonology. Now, part of the argument I want to make is that there really is no coherent doctrine of Satan as the fallen angel, either in the Hebrew Bible or in the Old Testament or in the New Testament. The doctrine of Satan, the fallen angel, was developed by the church fathers in the 3rd century, mainly this gentleman from Alexandria, Egypt. His name is Origen Adamantus. Origen Adamantus wrote a book called Of Principles, De Principis. And in this book he says, 6, regarding the devil and his angels and the opposing influences, the teaching of the church has laid down that these beings exist indeed. But what they are, or how they exist, it has not explained with sufficient clearness. This opinion, however, is held by most, that the devil was an angel, and that having become an apostate, he induced as many of the angels as possible to fall away with himself, and these up to the present time are called his angels. This is when, for the first time, the Christians create a coherent doctrine of Satan as the fallen angel. But it doesn't come until the 3rd century. This is after the Old Testament, after the New Testament. And what the church does, it reads back, and they're still not sure what the properties are. They then read this back into the Old Testament and to the New Testament and try then to make the doctrine, to give it consistency. Now, here is my point, friends. If the Christians can be so flexible in evolving this changing, nuanced view of the fallen angel, why can't Jamaicans have the same freedom? Why can't Jamaicans also share a similar freedom to evolve a doctrine of the fallen angel that reflects our cosmovision? That's all I'm saying. But the missionaries wouldn't allow or grant that freedom. There was one truth, it was absolute, and it held universally. So if you have a different teaching, that there are times when the fallen angel can be with Jesus and Miriam and can move around depending on the context, that is obviously a mark that you're an infidel. Now, what is very interesting, we have all been following recent events in Syria and Iraq with this group called ISIS. ISIS went after a group of people not so long ago, about a month or two ago, called the Yazidis. And they were hell-bent on wiping out the Yazidis. I asked myself, why the hell did they pounce on these people? These people were driven up to the mountain, and they barely survived. And ISIS slaughtered and beheaded thousands of them. Why are they so intent on killing out the Yazidis? And then I discovered the Yazidis worship a peacock, a blue peacock, which they say is the fallen angel. And the Sunni, Orthodox Sunni Islam people call them unbelievers. They worship a fallen angel. And that's their blue peacock deity. Except the Yazidis say the angel that is the blue peacock fell, but he will one day again be restored. That is exactly the doctrine that Origen Adamantus tried to preach at the end of De Principis, and they shut him down. But they took the section I read to you, but rejected the idea that the fallen angels could ever be redeemed. In other words, what I'm suggesting to you is that Jamaican people are more inclined to this flexible idea of the fallen angel, recognizing that he can be both malign but also benign. It depends on how you're using that power, and it's not strictly what we would call demonic or demonic. You with me? All right. Now, the other question that I had to raise was, okay, Jamaican people, when, where, and how did the figure of the fallen angel emerge, become part of this Jamaican pantheon of spirits? In other words, I feel I have shown you, demonstrated the presence of the fallen angel. And the fallen angel crops up again and again and again in people's research. The question that they haven't asked is, so where did it begin? Where did it come into this discourse of spirits? And here is what I found. In the 1920s, there was a tremendous penetration of the ritual space of Jamaica by North American Pentecostals. It is the penetration of North American Pentecostalism that put on the religious agenda this figure of the fallen angel. What happened is that the revivalists picked up on this character. The Pentecostalists are preaching against the fallen angel, and they simply syncretized, assimilated this powerful figure into their pantheon. In other words, you will not find any mention of the fallen angel before the 1920s, in fact, the late 1920s in Jamaica. One place that you would go to look, the obvious place for the fallen angel, would be Cassidy and LePage's classic Dictionary of Jamaican English. You look in vain, there is no entry for the fallen angel in the Dictionary of Jamaican English. But in the Gleaner of the 9th of June, 1928, there is a letter from a man called G.W. Thomas in Anchovy in St. James Parish near Montego Bay. And he says he is writing against a group called Spirites. Spirites that have been spreading their doctrine in Jamaica. And this man, Mr. Thomas, says, the Bible teaches that the dead are dead, and that between death and the awakening in the resurrection, there is no consciousness. And until the bishops, clergymen, and people in general divorce themselves from this false doctrine of the inherent immortality of the soul and teach and practice the truth respecting the state of the dead and the hope of the resurrection, they will continue to be deceived, and things will go from, what is it? Bad to worse in this direction. These spirits are demons, fallen angels. 2 Peter 2:4, Jude 6, who impersonate the dead to deceive the people. Now, what is happening here, what breaks out in 1928, is this theological battle between the Spiritists on one side and this gentleman, Mr. Thomas. But any discussion of the dead in Jamaica, the ears of the revivalists perk up. Because the dead, you have to be very sensitive to be open to working with the dead. On the 27th of January, this man is back on the attack on spiritualism, and he says, in your impression of the 17th, there appeared a letter by Mr. Manasseh Price, J. Manasseh Price. Now, I knew this man as a Garveyite on the margins, albeit of the Garvey movement, in 1921, but he was a free thinker. And Manasseh Price was a critic of Garvey, and the Garveyites came down, Mr. Garvey in particular came down heavily on Manasseh Price. But then he shows up later in the 1920s as a spiritist. He is the target of this man's invective, and what he is saying is, if you don't accept that when people die, they're done and dead, and you want to spiritualize them, meaning that you are speaking of demons. I haven't yet found sufficient data on this theological argument as it unfolded. When I go back, I'm going to pursue it. But this is at least a trace of some public discussion of the fallen angel. And my argument, I would say, is that the revivalists picked picked up on it. In 1964, Donald Hogg from Yale University came to Jamaica. He published a very influential early article on the convinced doctors, and then he produced his dissertation in an area of Jamaica known as St. Mary Parish. That's St. Mary, okay? It's between Ocho Rios and Port Antonio. It's a very, again, highly charged ritual space. That's where the 1760 Taki Rebellion and the first surfacing of Mile and Mile oathing occurred. In chapter 7, entitled The Rural Puckamania Cult, Donald Hogg has a section called Puckamanian Ideology, the World of Spirits. And he says, Puckamanians, down at the bottom, like their African ancestors, take a monistic view of the world. They believe that human beings and spirits affect one another significantly and remain irrevocably linked within a single unified social system. Okay. At the bottom now, Puckamanian ideas about heavenly angels and biblical prophets, even to the details of their individual characteristics, correspond closely with those of Zion revivalists. So on this score, you can't make a sharp distinction between Puckamanians and Zion revivalists. As in the latter cult, these two classes of spirits are confused or partially equated. Such figures as Jeremiah, Isaiah, and Moses come with Gabriel, Michael, and the other angels to possess the converts at meetings, and occasionally appear to cult officers in dreams and visions. The most generally important of these beings, what is that word? The most generally important of these beings is Joshua, who dwells in the sun and controls it. He possesses converted members at every major ceremony during a morning sun-gazing rite called the sundial. I collected data in Jamaica in the 1970s on these sundial worshippers. They would come out at midday. The sun was high in the heavens, and they would just look straight into the sun, unblinkingly, and they were called sundial people. The most, Indeed, they attempt to reserve prayer meetings for angels and to keep lesser beings away. Now, Walker and his wife has personal guardian. Walker was the leader of the group, have personal guardian angels who teach them heavenly secrets. What he goes on to say is that Walker is opposed. Walker is too progressive. Walker is opposed by the conservatives within the band, and those people believe that the fallen angel has a place in the revival ceremony. Puckamanians accept without question the idea that Satan and his followers have malevolent propensities and cause people much trouble. Yet they maintain that these spirits, just like their heavenly cousins, can be induced to perform beneficial tasks. It is true that working with them entails danger if one does not know well how to control them, but so does dealing basically with benevolent spirits. In other words, that's what Donald Hogg found in his fieldwork in St. Mary. This is the last one we're going to look at. Joseph Moore came from Northwestern University. He was a student of the great Afro-American anthropologist Melville J. Herskovits. And he goes to St. Thomas, which is the country of George Bogle, in 1865. He wrote a dissertation in June 1953 called Religion of Jamaican Negroes, a Study of Afro-Jamaican Acculturation. These are photographs from the dissertation of Ground Altar, Revival, Pocomania, Smashing the Altar, Possessions, the Second Table. And this is a diagram of one of the revival tables. It has 3 concentric circles. And this is what Professor Moore is told, quote, "The space immediately outside the 3rd circle is the space in which the members trump and which is the area of the fallen angels and the devil, and signifies the world, so that as they dance on the outside, they dance in the world." That is the world. And it is in this 3rd concentric circle that the fallen angels dance with people. Not separately, dance with people. Now, in his interviews, his key informant was Aaron Gordon, one of the most celebrated dancers of the Kumina cult. I spent time with Aaron Gordon in the 70s because he knew a great deal about the origins of the Rastafari cult, Rastafari movement in St. Thomas. Professor Moore says, quote, "When you are in labor, what happens? Are you conscious?" Gordon says, "Sure. When you labor until you reach a certain part, you see and you come back. Sometimes you labor all night." "How do you feel?" Moore asks him. And Gordon answers, a pleasurousness within yourself. It's not salvation. It's not connected to the principle, but you feel a pleasureness, a happy pleasureness, and you feel the power inside you. You feel the fallen angel and the power. That's the key informant for Joseph Moore. You feel a pleasureness. You feel the fallen angel and the power. How do you stomp? You stomp with the right foot because this foot belongs to God. Then you stomp with the left foot. The left foot is destruction and belongs to the fallen angel. You begin with the right foot because God first, then come destruction. Destruction and God, God and the fallen angel. They're just 2 powers that you tap into. They're not separated. The shepherd, Aaron Gordon's testimony ends this way. The shepherd works with the duppies at all times. He knows how to conduct divine service, which always precedes the worship of the fallen angels. The worship of the fallen angels. Obia means power, and therefore both are Obia men, for both work with power. He says that the power of the shepherdess is different from the Obia men in that the shepherdess's power comes from the Psalms and the fallen angels and the devil. The highest spirit served in Pocomania is God. This is God the Father. But you don't work with God. You serve him and you work with the devil. And sometimes the fallen angels come. But the devil always come in and stand nearby. Now, this is not intended to please you. This is intended really to make you aware. This is what people who have no malevolence or malevolent intentions, actually believe and are moved by it. They say it. Now, Barry Chavans, in his standard work, Rastafari, Roots and Ideology, tells us that he found 17 myths of the people regarding Marcus Garvey. And one of the first myths come from Bedwood, the Bedwoodites. To the Bedwoodites of his day, Garvey was the reincarnation of Moses, as Bedwood was the reincarnation of Aaron. The two brothers, one prophet, the other high priest, on whom God had bestowed the responsibility of leading his chosen people out of bondage. So to the followers of Alexander Bedwood, who was really the greatest revival prophet that Jamaica has produced, many of you would know the story of Bedwood. Bedwood told his people that at a certain day, at a certain time, he was going to fly from his church in Augustown. And the day came and the time came, and Bedwood went up into the tree, and he never took off. But Bedwood was the leader of a fantastic mass following. Now, this is a photograph of Bedwood on the left, and that's his church in Augustown. The remains of the church can still be found in Augustown near the university campus. Those are people being baptized in the Hope River, which was Bedwood's ritual. Thousands of people came to get the water that Bedwood blessed, and they were cured of many, many ailments. In April 1922, the Marxist journal, The Liberator in the United States, published an issue with an article by Claude McKay called Garvey as a Negro Moses. What's interesting is nobody has picked up, in my view, on what McKay had to say about Garvey and Bedwood. And here is what he says. To those who know Jamaica, the homeland of Marcus Garvey, Garveyism inevitably suggests the name of Bedwood. To those who know Jamaica, the homeland of Marcus Garvey, Garveyism inevitably suggests the name of Bedwoodism. And McKay then proceeds to show the close correspondence between Garvey and Bedwood. And what McKay says is that Garvey's views of Africa, how he thought about Africa, is exactly the same way that Bedwood thought of the world to come when he promised that he would ascend. Why hasn't anyone picked up on McKay's insight into the revival origin of Garvey's thinking? So here is McKay on one side, Garvey on one side, and Bedwood in the middle. The reason that we haven't done it is that we are ashamed of revivalism. And we don't want to associate Garvey with revivalism. That's our problem. I'll be frank about it. But would you attempt to study or write the life of Uriah Butler, a spiritual Baptist preacher and leader of the strike movement in Trinidad in 1937, and leave out his spiritual Baptist commitment? It wouldn't make any sense, would it? But if that seems logical, why are we so reluctant to face up to a similar identification, at least on the part of Garvey's followers and their perception of Garvey, and make the connection. Well, let me explain or illustrate now why we don't want to do it. In late March of 1936, in his final journal called The Black Man, published in London, England, Garvey wrote an editorial prefacing the reprint of an extensive newspaper account of Pocomania revival in Jamaica. I'm grateful that Mr. Garvey did that, because that particular issue of the Gleaner, from which it is taken, is no longer available. And so we are dependent on Garvey's reproducing the original to be able to read the content of that article. And here is what Garvey editorialized at the head of this reprinting of the article on Pocomania. Quote, "Man without religion is no better than the beast, and man with a bad or foolish religion is the same. Man's religion is revealed to him through his intelligence, and the civilized man of the present century has accepted the belief in one true and living God, who is approached through the medium of intelligence, in that he himself is supreme intelligence." According to Garvey, and he is right to this extent, Christianity and Christian doctrine is a revealed religion. But to 9/10 of the people who subscribe to the practice of revivalism in Jamaica, religion is not a revealed business. It don't come to you through revelation, okay? It's implicit as you conjure with nature and the spirits. Nobody is going to reveal anything to you. Garvey goes on, "It is unfortunate that some Negroes of the very illiterate class have not been able, through a sympathetic improvement of their education, to find this true and living God and worship him in the proper way, since man ought to have a religion." See, I don't even know that it is appropriate to call revivalism a religion. The people who actually engage in revivalism don't have a term called religion. Just like how anthropologists go to Africa and talk about traditional religion, this and traditional religion that. The people that they study do not have a concept of religion. To call it religion is ultimately to discipline it and put it into a Western template. Now here is Garvey. Out in a little island in the British West Indies called Jamaica, there exists a large number of ignorant Negroes who have been neglected educationally and culturally by the imperial and local governments. This neglect includes their economic, social, and general educational conditions, thereby leaving them entirely to themselves to reflect the lowest of their animal natures and dispositions. In this freedom of barbaric expression, they have invented a religious cult of their own, which is called Pocomania. The following article, taken from the Jamaica Daily Gleaner, reveals the scope of this fanatical religion, which is libelous to the intelligence of the real Jamaican Negro and the Negro race as a whole. But whilst the Jamaican Negroes are practicing Pocomanianism, a certain section of the Negroes of America have accepted a Negro god by the name of Father Divine. And then at the end, he concludes, it shows that there has been very little sincerity in the proper education of the Negro in Christian civilization. Otherwise, he never could have so departed from the intelligent action of the civilized being of the 20th century as to constitute himself a God in the one instance and to be behaving as he's doing with Pocomanianism in Jamaica in the other. Garvey wants to exclude this whole realm of reality from having anything to do with civilized, intelligent Negroes. Yet on the other hand, he makes the injunction that a people without knowledge of his past is like a tree without roots. Now, you can't have it both ways. You have to accept all of it and then work it out. But Garvey wants to have a particular historical narrative of civilization for the Negro race. And I'm saying that when you do that, what the people thought of Garvey has to be shut out. Because if the people think of Garvey as a fallen angel and putting his wife to sleep in a trance, that clearly is not part of this other narrative. Okay? Well, I'll spare you this. Many of you, can we play this? Okay? Yes. How do we? Okay. I have to. Is okay. Okay. Here is a song that was very popular. Okay. Earlier this year, as I came to my senses and realized that I needed to begin my own serious study of revival religion, I found a revival preacher in Claremont in the hills of St. Anne. And I went to visit his church. And there on the wall, I saw this painting, and it's called Revival Time, which is the title of the lecture. It was painted by one of his members. And I thought that if we cannot integrate these revival worshipers into our conception of history, we are in trouble. Not only are we in trouble with the history, we are in trouble with our politics. We are in trouble with our culture. We are in trouble with our identity as a people. We have to find a way to them and make them school us in this tremendous power that they encompass. Now, the question is, do you approve or disapprove? Mr. Garvey would not have approved of my approach to this subject tonight. But it's not up to Garvey to dictate what constitutes our history. And I would like to leave you with the question of whether this lady, would she have approved of reopening this whole semi-secret world of spirits? Would she? That's the question I want to leave you with. And I leave you with the Jamaican injunction, as we say, Jack Mandora, me no choose none. Thank you.
At this point, we will take a few questions from the audience. There are microphones in there, which we ask you to use. And as usual, we ask you to keep your questions brief, please. You want some water?
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you.
So who wants to be first?
Behind you.
There's a microphone behind you. Okay.
Can you get it?
Yeah, I'll open it first.
Thank you, Professor Hill. It was very enlightening. And I felt very involved with your questions about Pocomia and all this revival religion. Because I'm from Brazil. And I didn't feel like laughing at certain things because this is part of daily life. So just one thing I would propose, that to see the revival, to look around and see the roots of those Afro-religions when the good and the bad, God and Satan is the same. Eshu is seen as Satan by the Christian religion in Brazil, but Eshu is pretty much part of the same table when you have Oxóssi, Oxum, Ogum, and all the other saints and goddesses, and even what do you call, Senhor do Bonfim, which is God itself, the same table. And actually they are related. Ogum is the brother of Eshu, and one is the saint, and the other one is the Satan. So the cosmology of those religions coming from Africa, talking about Brazil, Haiti, Cuba, and others, they are pretty much alive, a part of the resistance, and the dead are never dead, and they come back and they dance. Actually, they dance, candomblé, umbanda, kimbanda. So I just want to ask you one question. Would the revival also have this influence of the Jamaican contact with Cuba and Haiti in the turn of the century?
Thank you for your comments. You're pointing me in an interesting direction. Yes, revival has a strong connection with Cuba. And again, I haven't seen this brought out in the literature. It was the returning Jamaican laborers from Cuba, Jamaican laborers who had become part of the religion in Cuba known as Palo Monte. They came back to Jamaica, and the word Pocomania is actually a mispronunciation. I have an essay by a man who used to be a census taker, and he wrote this long essay saying, I knew these Pocomania people. I knew how they started. They had come back from Cuba, and what they had brought back from Cuba was an extreme form of this Congo religion. It's not the other version of Afro-Cuban religion. And so these returning Jamaican laborers come back with Palomonte, and that becomes known as Pocomania. Now, my feeling is that all of these religions of our region, of our homelands, are really struggling with trying to find a way to speak to all sides of our experience. Our problem is we don't incorporate and apply the insights of the followers of Garvey to Garvey because they are revival rooted. For instance, Barry Chavans, who I mentioned, says there are 17 myths that he found among the people related to Garvey. But when you go down the list, they are all connected with revival. But Barry, who is one of the main investigators of revival in Jamaica, says revival and Rasta, he thinks are related. And he got a lot of stick for that. Can you imagine the stick that he would have gotten had he said, and all 17 of these myths are rooted in revival? That would have been too great a scandal. That, you see, is our problem. We have to renounce this mental separation of our politics from this world of spirit. That's what Wilson Harris was trying to say. That's what Camus Brathwaite has been trying to say. That's what George Lamming has been trying to say. And we have known this. I decided to get bold tonight and say, to hell with it, I'm going to put it out there. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Hill. It was wonderful to hear spirit in academic discourse.
Thank you.
It was wonderful to actually sit and think through some of these things that have been part of my existence in Jamaica and out of Jamaica. Mm-hmm. I was curious, though, in terms of the Powhatan name, and for revivalists who have a very complex cosmology, which they name in different ways. There are moments when cult is used in a way quite dismissively, which was quite disturbing, in part because I see the power of calling it a religion, not so much in the kind of Western definition of religion, but using religion as a means of legitimating these systems of thought as valid, and understanding that they're rooted in a very highly complex understandings of balance, of harmony of the world, of man and woman's existence with nature and all of that. And I think that's what calling them religion offers in terms of making them be read and understood to those who see these as just mad people with pencil in them head jumping up and down, right? And while they do those things, what's underlying that kind of animated action gets elided when we just call them cults, you know. I think also what Dr. Hosha was mentioning in terms of the non-exceptionalism of revivalism, I think is key, because revivalism isn't exceptional when you're looking at the range of Afro-Atlantic religious expressions. However, the exceptionalism in revival is what it does with Christianity. Because unlike Palomonte, Vodun, Santeria, Candomblé, these systems of thoughts, which with origins from Africa, various parts of Africa, that's the systems of thought coming from the Yoruba traditions or the Congo traditions have a place that is so much more powerful than Christianity. Unlike revival, revival is taking biblical texts and changing the face of it. It's not bringing in African deities. None of the deities within the pantheon of revivalism. Well, not none. Yeah. Very few. You have a few Indian spirits. You have a few African spirits. But the overarching pantheon of divinities are derived from the Christian text, which actually speaks to this exceptionalism revival as an Afro-Atlantic religious system. Something to process and think through.
Thank you for that comment. I would disagree and say that though the lexicon of Christian deity and Christian beliefs are present, they are systematically reworked on the ground so that, we know the names are derived from Christian beliefs, but it gets transformed in the process. And so we are, to go to the first point you made, we are, in a sense, we have to accept that investigators who came before us, who did not have the kind of theoretical sophistication that we would bring today to the field work, they're working in 1950, 1949, 1952. We just have to accept the work as they present it. And it's couched, I admit, in a language that is very problematic. But still, the data we can locate within that language should not be discarded or disavowed. But thank you very much. George. Oh, okay. Thank you.
A very interesting lecture. I was particularly interested in what you had to say because of the question that the humanities now faces about its relevance.
Yeah.
And the fact that people are wanting to get rid of the humanities as an idea in universities. And I was wondering whether, when you ask the two questions, we have to think about history the way it happened and history the way people imagine that it happened. I was wondering whether, was my voice that was being taken? Okay. Yeah, I was wondering whether that isn't the crux of the matter, that as a humanities idea, we have actually made that distinction between history, the way that it happened, and history, the way that people imagine it happened, and that is the crux of the problem that we have made, and that you are asking us to recognize that the relevance will only return when we recognize history the way people imagine that it happened is important. But I'm thinking, isn't both things the same? You see, because we have credited history the way it happened as though it was the way it happened, when it was actually the way certain professionals determined that it happened. And I'm wondering whether, I was thinking today whether the same thing isn't the case with literature, that we have credited the works of the imagination as though it had a special significance that was outside of the works of the imagination of the ones walking about and talking. So I just wanted to ask you to think about that and say something about it.
Thank you. That's all I can say. Thank you. You've said it better, more clearly, more cogently than I ever could. Thank you. George? Yeah. Yeah.
I will let her go ahead until that one gets fixed.
Oh, pleasant good evening. My question to you, thanks for a very enlightening presentation in terms of opening my eyes in terms of discourse relating to African-derived religions within the Caribbean. And one of the things that I'm interested in, because I'm looking at the area of spirituality for my master's course in cultural studies. And why I'm particularly interested, because I'm focusing on performing the sacred within Spiritual Baptists in Barbados, Trinidad, and St. Vincent. And listen, and revival, lace and Rastafarian. Also looking at the different strains and elements to see how they all fit in. But something interesting is coming out in what you're saying. And that is that they all have a connection in one way or the next in terms of how Afro-Caribbean people, position themselves within this space of plantation societies. Yeah. And the way how they had to survive and maintain certain oral traditions to continue then, like pass on the knowledge base. So my question is, you're looking at Rastafarians, you're looking at, where you talk about the Bedouadism with spiritual Baptist influence, and then also you have the revivalists with the Pocominians and all that. So my question is, within this part of the hemisphere with Barbados, St. Vincent, Trinidad, and the link now with Jamaica, where spiritual Baptist is more prominent, and going back to Jamaica, where you have the strong elements of Mailism, Rastafarians, and revivalists, how all that connects, and how would you read that within a Caribbean discourse?
Yeah. I don't want to take a position of giving you some kind of code or presenting some idea that there is a code that will automatically achieve the translations across the territories that you seem to be asking for. I want to be more modest and say we have to work at this piece by piece, stage by stage. What I showed you tonight was the tip of a larger investigation of prophetic figures as really channeling the cosmovision of revivalism, even if they themselves aren't aware of it. That to me is hard enough to show just in the Jamaican case and what I was trying to do tonight. And I don't want to leap from there to then take on this infinitely larger challenge of finding the points of translation.
Right.
I agree that in principle they must be there, they have to be there. It's just going to take work to work them out. But I think you've asked a valid question. I just don't have the energy tonight.
Yeah, thank you, but all I'm saying to the is that I've realized there's a correlation and there's a strong link
Definitely.
between all the various religions.
Definitely. For example, let me give you one correlation. The St. Vincent government prohibited, outlawed the spiritual Baptists in St. Vincent in 1912. The Trinidad government outlawed the spiritual Baptists in 1917. How come they didn't do that in Jamaica with hundreds and hundreds of petitions and letters from all kinds of social groups, politicians calling for the outlawing of revivalism, particularly outlawing of Pocomania, because Pocomania became dominant in the 1930s. They never dared. And they prohibited obia, but they never dared to prohibit Pocomania and revival. And you know why? They knew that it was done in Trinidad, and they knew that St. Vincent. The point was, spiritual Baptists did not have the same kind of roots extending right across the society. Had the colonial regime attempted to do that in Jamaica, there would have been an outright revolt and rebellion. But what happened, you see, is that in 1940, under cover of the war, they introduced a prohibition against certain literature. And they masked it by including George Padmore and some socialist Marxist tracts, but the real object was the outlawing and prohibiting of the literature coming down from Chicago, from De Lawrence. And what happened is that drove a wedge between the extreme wing of revival, which is the Pocomania wing, and the revival Zion. And what the revival Zionists said is, we don't business with Poco because you're dealing with science and De Lawrence. So that what happened was that there came, after 1940, this internal disavowal of the fallen angel. And the fallen angel became, by definition, a negative definition of who you were and who you are. But they never could get the courage to outlaw revival or Pocomania in Jamaica. Okay, George?
I wanted to just make some observations that have to do with language. Now, I noticed that you, throughout the lecture, continue to say culture, history, culture, history.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that one should more appropriately speak of culture in the plural.
Mm-hmm.
That there is no fixity to culture.
Mm-hmm.
What you are speaking of is the variety of cultures. A particular culture is created at one stage of experience, is eroded or demolished at another stage of experience, which produces another kind of culture. And it is this variety of cultures to which we then give that overarching term, culture.
Mm-hmm.
And the same is true of history.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking of histories in the plural
Mm-hmm.
when we say history. And I think it's a failure to get that distinction between the reality of history as histories and the thinking of history and culture as fixties.
Yes.
And I think we must make that distinction clear when we attempt these kinds of investigations. So that I was wondering whether in your investigations of Pocomania, say in the 1920s, and your investigations of Pocomania, say 50 years, 70 years, 100 years later, do you recognize differences in the manifestations of these things, or are they exactly the same? And I ask that because I then try to think of what you imagine as a future. What would be the manifestation of Pocomania, or whatever name is given to such manifestations, say 100 years today. The second, I keep thinking, because I've been very involved in thinking of the history of language itself. It's a very interesting study of how it came about, how it got fragmented into this thing of French and English and Spanish and all those kinds of vernaculars. And having what may seem a very curious thing for me to say, come to think of writing as a great misfortune. Because what writing did was to interfere with the integrity of the voice and the oral tradition. The oral tradition gave a more exact reflection of the consciousness than the written ever word could. And what writing did, writing intervened, and because it was backed by the army and had therefore a kind of power behind
The state.
the voice and the oral tradition lost its authority, lost its integrity, and in fact became almost what you would call irrelevant, when it was in fact the real source of the voice of consciousness. So we have writing displacing the oral tradition, and now when I see all this apparatus around me, we have something called technology abolishing writing.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Your points are very well taken, particularly the first one about the multiple histories, multiple cultures, and we tend to impose a very static monism on history, quote unquote, culture, quote unquote, and I agree. I know that it's a pitfall that I too fall into, and I use it like a shorthand, but the substantive point, your point is well taken.
We just have two final questions. One over here.
Yes, thank you for a beautiful presentation. You mentioned potential or a connection between the politics and this cosmology. The issue of the colonizers' view of the world and its ability to deal with the aspects in Trinidad and St. Vincent, but not in Jamaica. Now, the politics and the link is something that I want to ask you if you have surveyed or if you have investigated to any extent, to what extent. Just one thing. In the early 2000s, a former student of ours invited us to the birthday celebration of Edward Siaga in West Kingston. Now, when you did that concentric circles,
Yes.
the place where we were was exactly like that. And the extent of food, fruits,
Yes.
flowers, and everything was there.
Yes.
And
There's a table.
yeah, the table, yes.
Yes. A
But it
revival
wasn't
table.
disturbed, you know. But
Yes.
the whole thing, it was something that was so all-pervasive. Even from the beginning, we drove in there. And, you know, in today's world, as George talked about the technology, you lock the car and you hear beep beep.
Yes.
We locked the car, and the guys came and they were upset with us. I can't use the words they told us about that we must open the car because you're safe and so on. For the audience, West Kingston is a problem area and so on, but Siaga was the representative for 40 years. And the people outside were upset that we thought we needed to lock the car. We were
Correct.
invited, so we should leave it open.
Yes.
But I was wondering if you could just, if you've investigated it, what is the most essential element you would think of as the link between the Pocomini, etc., and Kumina, Queenie, etc., and the politics? Because it seems to emerge on the hustings all the time. It is pervasive throughout the society.
Yes, you observed well, brother. I didn't include it tonight, though it was a candidate for inclusion. Edward Siaga's monograph on Jamaican revival cults. He lived among the Pocomanians in West Kingston in 1952, 53, and part of 1954. And that field study is linked with the work of George Eaton Simpson and Joseph E. Moore, and also Donald Hogg. Siaga emerges from West Kingston with a detailed knowledge of the dynamics and the inner workings of revival, Pocomania, and Kumina. In fact, Siaga also recorded the music of revival and released it in a small printing. Siaga's ability to communicate with the people of West Kingston is largely due to his legitimacy in their eyes. He knew the language, he knew the rituals. Now, you could say from a left perspective that he manipulated the people. But the fact of the matter is that it gave him tremendous purchase politically. Now, his grandfather, he has told me this story of his own life, and I think it's in his autobiography too. His grandfather was a shopkeeper in West Kingston, and he told me he used to like to go and visit his grandfather as a young boy, and not only because he was pampered as grandfathers and grandparents usually do, but he said it was there that he saw for the first time walking along the street these revivalists, and they were so fascinating. He said he at every opportunity would go and attend their revivals. So it wasn't something that came about later politically. From his childhood, he saw and felt the incredible power of revival and its ethos. He put it to good use politically. Now, earlier this year, I'm now retired, and so I live now again in Jamaica, my home. I just decided, I'm tired with the archives. I've done a lot of archival work. I need to find out from the people, where is revivalism today? So I set out in my car, driving through the hills of St. Anne, meeting people, talking with them. And the thing that I realized, because when you're in their midst and talking, all of a sudden they will get possessed. And they will start to communicate in this esoteric language. The thing that hit me is that the way we as Jamaicans speak is intimately tied up with revival. The rhythm, the cadences, the ideas, the leaps of imagination is just so the revivalists speak. And what I am now fascinated to inquire more into is the link between language and revivalism. The music that I would have played if the technology had permitted tonight, you would have heard in the music. So whether it's music, or as George said, culture, or as I say, language, I guess we could say languages, we have a lot to learn. And this dismemberment of our very being, by separating out and fragmenting these powerful, potentially unifying bodies of ideas and experience, has to now become more a priority for us as historians. I'm glad I did the archival work. That's indispensable. But it was in the course of doing the archival work that I also had to do interviews, oral interviews with people. And the challenge is to match up the orality of the lived experience with what the archives have to say. Never easy, and there is no surefire tool or prescription. You just have to keep doing the work. But I find it deeply, deeply satisfying. For example, when my housekeeper found out that I was interested in these spirits, at first she was like, wait, you turn Obia man upon me? Okay? She's afraid Obia, like everybody else in Jamaica. But she now began to tell me stories from her childhood. She said it was terrifying when they would be breaking the table. She says she came from Alexandria up in St. Anne, on the border of Manchester and St. Anne. She says the people took the dry coconuts and smashed and threw against the walls. These are hard, dry coconuts. And she used to run when they started to throw the coconuts. And then she would come out another day, and then she told me about these giants who were the fallen angels. And now she tells me her sister is a revivalist. Do I want to go and meet her sister? Once you begin to penetrate down through the social layers, man, there is a world of knowledge out there. And I want to believe that Elsa Goveia waited all her life for this turn to come in our historiography. I think that's why she was so present and alive to any kind of historical initiative. She would have been the first person to welcome the kind of the rich ethnographic data being brought into the historiography and expanding it. And that's why she and Camus Brathwaite had such a tight bond, because she saw in Camus the person who was doing it, okay? I wish we could have a conversation with Camus to describe what he and Elsa Goveia were up to, for example, when they formulated the idea of creolization. In that sense, Elsa Goveia was more akin to what Braithwaite was doing than to Douglas Hall or Roy Auger, okay, or Campa and those people. Now, here is something I had difficulty choosing tonight. In 1973, I went to England to work at the PRO, and while I was there, Richard Hart invited me to a meeting to introduce me to the son of Barbados, Peter Blackman. Peter Blackman. And Peter told me, for some reason, about his friendship with Elsa Goveia when she was a student in London. And you know what Peter Blackman told me? He said the people that had the greatest influence on Elsa Goveia as a student were fellow African graduate students who were in her seminar on colonial historiography. And he said the person that she was closest to was Kenneth Onwuka Dike, the author of Trade and Politics in the Niger Delta. I wish someone would investigate Elsa Goveia's relationship with the founding of the School of African Historiography that took root in Ibadan. But it goes back to their graduate school days in the late 40s and early 50s. And what Peter Blackman told me is that Elsa was at the center of that. Here is the point. Elsa would not be the first, nor would she be the last Guyanese to feel the attraction of Africa. There is something in the Guyanese that finds Africa very congenial. I don't know what it is, but it stands out. And it seems to me that Cave Hill, the Department of History at Cave Hill, should think about opening up this vein and look into Elsa Goveia's relations with the burgeoning school of African historians who came to maturity after World War II. Thank you. I've got it out.
Thank you very much, Richard, and for the pleasure of putting on the full stop. I'm certain you'll be glad to know that your partner in crime, Comrade Ralph, have a liking for the 2-7 clash and was a major motif in one of his election campaigns.
Oh.
And that's well documented. So, and you could speak to him too, and he would educate you on that. But I have two questions for you. And these are questions, you know, I always put to you, and I'm going to put them again in the public domain. Every time we speak about Garvey, we tend to make Garvey into this all-important figure.
Yes.
And we know the Garvey movement sprung up all around the world without Garvey not being there.
Yes.
And I think your lecture points to the power of the idea more than the man.
Yes.
And I think very often we get very taken up with these traditional notions of interrogation.
Yes.
So, my question to you, how significant do you think the spiritual element of the Garvey movement was in its attractiveness to people across the world?
It was very important, but it's not separate from everything else. For example, the last major push research-wise that I did into Garvey before this link with revival came on my radar was the investigation of Garvey and the friendly societies. Here in Barbados, for example, the role of the friendly societies, fantastically important. The movement here in Barbados known as the Land Something Army, Landship, is an outgrowth of the friendly societies. In other words, to separate out the spiritual or the religious, as some people would refer to it, from everything else and make that a kind of explanatory heuristic paradigm, I think misunderstands how people actually experience the struggles to create and build and maintain their friendly societies and everything else in their lives. So what I would say is, yes, very, very important, but it's only important in relationship to the ongoing struggles in people's lives. And that's why it seems to me so, looking back now, I'm very critical of my own pathway into this subject. Why didn't I see this before? Why is it, I turned 71 years last week. Why is it coming so late to me? Yes, but I feel, had I seen this 10 years ago, I would have been able to really do something significant with it, or I would try. But the first point you made about this reified figure of Garvey, the great hero, the great man, this bigging up of Garvey, that particularly in Jamaica, every time I go to Jamaica and I have to give a lecture, they want you to big up Marcus Garvey. And I say, you know, I'm a little tired of that. It's not so interesting. We have to complicate the discourse of Garvey. And what I tried to show tonight is his utter disdain and repudiation of Pocomania and revival, that we need to take on board and to take that seriously. And when you do that, he becomes far more interesting than this cardboard figure, you know, with the hat and the plumes, and then he doesn't move. What I realize is that Garvey was always terrified of his position being undermined from not the left Marxist socialist, but from the ranks of popular religion. See how he went after Father Divine at the same time? That was where he saw himself as most vulnerable. But thank you for reinforcing the point. Okay.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you very much.
All right, Mr. Senny. All right, just let me, in closing, just give me a minute, Prof. Just, first, to point out that on Wednesday coming, Wednesday the 12th, you are invited to the keynote lecture to be delivered by Professor John Cottingham on philosophy, religion, and the meaning of life. And given what we have heard here this evening, we think that will just be, you know, the theme of religion will continue, because that is the keynote address for the opening of the K-Phil Philosophy Symposium next week. So Wednesday, 7:30 in the 3W's pavilion on the other side. In closing, I wish to, on behalf of the head and on behalf of the department, wish to extend our gratitude to several persons. First of all, to our speaker, Professor Hill. We also want to say thanks to our sponsors, the nation. And there are several persons and units within the university who once again contributed to the success that is the Elsa Goveia lecture. I want to single out the Educational Media Services Campus Lecture Series, the UWI Conference Facilities, Public Information, the Office of Public Information as well. And I'm certain that together, all these agencies and the department, well, assuming, Margaret, the department is still here for another 30 years, we will continue to celebrate the life and work of Elsa Goveia. I also wish to thank you for coming, because if we do all the hard work, Ms. Spooner, Ms. Trotman, because see Angela has gone, Ms. Lucas from the department, if we do all the hard work and then nobody turns up, then, you know, it isn't worth it. So we want to thank you for coming, and we invite you to join us outside for some refreshments. And there, for all those who didn't get to ask a question, I'm certain Professor Hill will be willing to continue the discussion. So thank you, and get home safely.